when you buy a good or a service. So that's really important. Next slide, please. And the same is true when we're talking about grant expenses as well. And, you know, in this case, it's a grant if the NPO that makes the grant doesn't receive anything directly in return, which is different from procurement. And you have to look at the different circumstances, but the really important thing in there is that you don't get something of equal benefit back in return in terms of what you're doing. So in the proposals for both grant revenue and grant expenses, we talk about two types of grant arrangements. We talk about an enforceable grant arrangement, an EGA, and we talk about an other funding arrangement, an OFA. Next slide, please. And I'm going to talk a bit first about enforceable grants arrangements and just recap on the principles that are there. So an enforceable grant arrangement requires that both parties to the grant arrangements have both rights and obligations. So it's not a one-way thing, it's a two-way thing. And really importantly as well, that it's enforceable by both parties through legal or equivalent means. And I'll come back to that. And the other important thing about an enforceable grant arrangement is that it must have at least one enforceable grant obligation. So we'll move on to the next slide, please. So an enforceable grant obligation describes the activity or the action that an NPO has to take to be entitled to the grant. It needs to be distinct and it needs to be separate so that both parties can monitor that particular activity and know what progress has been made and whether it's been completed and whether it's been done. And so the terminology that we're applying, which many of you will be familiar with, is that it's a present obligation. So it has to be satisfied before the NPO is entitled to the grant. And the mirror is true on grant expenses at the same time that there is a present obligation by the grant recipient. There is a grant fulfillment right to the grant provider. That is the right for something to be done. So I can move to the next slide, please. So as I said, enforceability is really key here because the enforceability means that for the grant provider, that the action that is in the grant arrangement needs to be completed. And then for the grant recipient, that they are entitled to have resources transferred to them in return for completing the action or activity that's described. So those are really important, as is the fact that there are remedies available if either party does not meet its obligations in the arrangement. But can move on to the next slide, please. So enforceability, sort of talked about it relates to both parties. What the guidance also says that, yes, it's enforceable if there is the legal ability to do that. And that applies whether or not it's used in practice. So it is the ability to do that is important. Secondly, it can be if there's something that exists in a particular jurisdiction, such as regulatory conditions or custom and practice that has the same resonance as legal enforcement, that may be sufficient as well to create enforceability. And the third area is about the potential to withhold funding. And this only applies if it's linked to another enforceable grant arrangement between the same grant provider and grant recipient. So if failure to to deliver on one grant arrangement may result in withdrawal or reduced funding on another grant arrangement, that may also be sufficient to create enforceability. Can move to the next slide, please. So in looking at the rights and obligations, sometimes that will be very easy to identify. Sometimes there will be interdependent activities taking place. The guidance allows for those to be aggregated until such time as you have a single distinct grant fulfillment right and grant obligation. So that can then form a single enforceable grant obligation. The important thing in there is that it has to be distinct and separate so that, as I said before, progress can be measured and monitored. The guidance also says that the monitoring of progress against an enforceable grant obligation is probably in most circumstances an administrative task and not an enforceable grant obligation on its own. And similarly, things like compliance obligation, like following particular procurement processes or requirements around money laundering, terrorism, modern slavery, for example, compliance obligations in an arrangement, they are also not enforceable grant obligations. So important to separate the administrative aspects of the grant arrangement from the actual doing of the actions or tasks that have been laid out. Finally, to the other funding arrangement, this is basically everything else. So it's all things that are not an enforceable grant obligation arrangement. As set out in the guidance, it can be written, it can be oral, it can be implied, or there may be no arrangement at all for fundings that are these types of funding. We do recognise that, and it's recognised in the guidance, that that funds that are received as part of an other funding arrangement may have some constraint or restriction as to use. That could be about time, location, or purpose. But the important thing here that we draw out is that the limitation that is there is not specific enough to create a present obligation. And if there is no present obligation, then it is definitely another funding arrangement, even if there is some limitation. Next slide, please. I'm just going to touch on recognition and measurement, which will be a segue into topics 2 and 3, which will be covered topic 2 later in this session and topic 3 in a session this afternoon. But common to both grant revenue and grant expenses, if it is an enforceable grant arrangement, then revenue or an expense, depending which side you're on, is only recognised when the enforceable grant obligation is met, and on the mirror side of that, when the grant fulfillment right is met. I should say here that enforceable grant obligations, depending on how they're structured, can be met at a point in time or they can be met over time. So it depends on what the grant arrangement says as to when that revenue is recognised. And it is measured at the standalone amount, the amount that has been identified for achieving that specific enforceable grant obligation. If there's only one, that will be straightforward. If there's more than one enforceable grant obligation in a grant arrangement, then there is a need to identify the standalone amounts for each of them. So I'm turning now to an OFA, if I have the next slide, please. Again, for both grant revenue and grant expenses, they are recognised when the resources are transferred. So if you are a grant recipient, you recognise it when the resources have been transferred to you. And if you are a grant maker, they are recognised at the point that you provide the resources to another party. In terms of measurement, they are, if you are a grant recipient, they are measured at the fair value of the resources received. If you are the grant maker, then it is measured at the carrying amount of the resources transferred. And frequently they will be the same, but sometimes they might not be. So that is a very brief walk through the key proposals that relate to the common model. And I'm now going to hand back to Sam to talk about where do you go next in terms of moving into discussion.
Aha, and I can unmute. Great. And I'm going to unspotlight you, Karen. Super. So thank you, Karen. That was a very quick overview reminder. Those of you following in Spanish, sorry, there isn't transcripts or things like that, but you have sent you the links to the slide decks in Spanish and French. So we're now going to do breakout rooms. I think there will be probably 4 breakout rooms, 3 in English and 1 Spanish. The questions to discuss are on the screen, and I've also put them in the chat. I recommend that if you can, copy from the chat and paste into the chat in your breakout room, because you won't be able to see the slide. I'd like, if in the English groups, you'll be called group 1, group 2, group 3, or room 1, room 2, room 3. Start with the question number that's the same as your room number. Even if you then move to other questions, it's great if you could start with that question so we get everything discussed. Now, I know some people have kindly volunteered to record those breakout rooms for us onto their local computers. Thank you very much. If there's nobody in your room that's got rec in their name, I'd be very grateful if you might just discuss between you somebody who could be a sort of scribe and take note of 3 to 5 key bullet points that come out from your discussion, because we'd love to get that into the chat when we come back together. We can't record ourselves the breakout rooms, so it's really important that we can capture the feedback that you're sharing. So I think, Brian, are you ready to, I'm going to stop sharing here because the questions are in the chat. I'll put the questions in Spanish as well. Brian, are you ready to open the breakout rooms?
Yes, I'm ready.
Let me just put the questions in Spanish. They're in the chat, so you can copy them. And can you make sure people can unmute themselves as well, so that when you get to the breakout rooms, you're able to actually speak?
And just to say that myself and my colleagues from SIPFA might pop into your breakout rooms, just mostly just to check to make sure that you've got no questions or issues there. So please do continue the conversation and don't be put off by our appearance.
If you have any problems, the way you can message to the host, please feel free to do that. Or you can leave the breakout and come back. Me and Brian will be here if you've got any problems. Otherwise, please enjoy the conversation that you have. And we will have 20 minutes together, and then we'll come back and share some of your comments and feedback. Thank you very much, Brian. If you want to open the room. Your thoughts in the chat now, if you've been able to summarize them or some of the key points that you really want us to hear, please make sure that's in the chat. What we're going to do is launch a poll. So Brian, if you could launch poll 1 now. And we'll have this open for a time. It's in Spanish and French as well. So hopefully the Spanish group can also answer that. So basically, we've got a few minutes now. I won't do too much talking. Fill in the poll and share your thoughts in the chat, if you wouldn't mind. If you would like to type in Spanish, Español, it's fine. Sí, Español message. My Spanish, terrible. You can type in Spanish. Okay. Okay, I think I'm going to end the poll so you can all see the results. And I'll just explain these a bit, and then we can feed into also via the chat. It's actually not a big group. I'm wondering if we just do offer the opportunity to unmute, but we've only got 8 minutes. But anyway, let's see. So in terms of the poll, some really interesting results here. So the first question, do you agree with the terms, enforceable grant arrangement and enforceable obligation? So 67% saying yes, 26 yes, but, a no, and a not sure. So from the chat, I'm seeing, yes, the terms are simple and easy to understand. But in terms of the buts, what if there are funds in between an OFA and an EGA? An OFA seems too open and unrestricted. So this, I'm not sure that this is the intent, but the reading of it is that an OFA is unrestricted, it's loose, it's not as tight. And therefore, maybe what if there's internal control problems or abuse or misreporting? Does that mean that you've got no recourse just because it's an OFA? So these are really interesting feedback. I think our understanding of it is that an OFA can still be a written agreement. It could have even enforceable elements to it. There could be prohibitions about what you can't spend it on. There could be rules. There could be reporting requirements in an OFA. The big distinguishing feature between an EGA and an OFA is this idea of enforceable grant obligations, which somebody else has talked about in the UK, sometimes called conditions, the things that have to be done, delivered as part of the purpose of the grant. But this is really interesting, this feedback, because it's sounding like you're uncomfortable putting those things into an OFA. So this is really helpful. And if you'd like to put any other commentary on what I'm saying in the chat, please do. Do you agree with the definition of an EGA is the second question. 76% saying yes, 5 saying yes, but, and a no. So again, if you would add that to the chat, we might not be able to read all of the chat right now, but it certainly will be, we will look at it in detail. So generally yes, but some reservations. Question 3, do you agree that all grants and donations can be categorized as EGA or OFA? And again, we've got a smaller yes. There's 55% saying yes, 23 yes, but 14% no. So I think this is an area where it's going to be interesting to look at carefully at the suggestions. And the fourth question, do you agree that regulatory oversight and customary practices can be sufficient? We've got 39% yes, 26% yes, but 22% no and not sure. So quite a bit more of a variety there. And I saw some things in the chat about what if the donor says it's a certain type of contract? Can they have differing views? What if it's enforceable one way? What if there are different rules in different countries? And these are debates that we had at the advisory groups as well. I think these are issues that we need to unpack. So that's very helpful. And then the last, and that is the fourth of 4 questions.
So can I ask a question, because I'm just looking at some of the comments in the chat, and this is something that was discussed about the use of the word contract. When we were developing this, a number of stakeholders said to us, it's not a grant arrangement is not a contract, and that, you know, even though it might have some legal backing to it, it's not a contract, it's something different. And just seeing some of the words in here would suggest that's not something that everyone might agree with. And I just wondered, even if you could put some responses to that in the chat, it would be really helpful. I can see Asietu has got a hand up. Are we able to unmute Asietu? Sam, you're on mute.
Yes, I'm unmuted here. Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you stay. I do agree, Karen, with your point. In most of the agreements that we currently have, these are not contracts. They're really, I mean, more agreement than anything else, in terms of grant management. So, whether it's a foundation, whether it comes from sovereign. So the term agreement might fit better the reality of it.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you for that, Asieti.
Helena, did you want to come in very briefly? Welcome.
Let me.
You should be okay now.
Oh, right. Sorry. Yes, I am. I agree totally on that comment. And my thought is really that in the UK, a contract would be seen by HMRC to not be a grant agreement. So I would be concerned that that classification might cause issues for charities in the UK as well.
Great. Thank you. That's helpful.
Interesting. In the meeting I had yesterday, Karen, our CFO said exactly the opposite. Said that USAID awards can be framed as grants or contracts, but for example, a contract where USAID is engaging an NPO to do, I don't know, election monitoring in another country, USAID aren't the direct beneficiary of that work, even though they're contracting an NPO to do it on their behalf. So I think there's still possibly work to do there.
Thank you.
Great. So keep typing. As I say, we can't necessarily digest all this now, but it's really, really valuable and we love having these comments. We're trying to condense basically a one-day event into 90 minutes. So hence, I'm sorry if it does feel a little bit rushed and squished, but we're hoping this is one of the best ways to squeeze as much valuable information out of you as we can. So I think we're going to move now on to the second part of our event, which I'm going to, oh no, I've done the poll. Right, over now to Sarah.
Hello, thank you, everyone. And I've got the poll answers up as well. Can we move to the first slide on grant expenses then, please? Brilliant. And this I've got quite a short time because Karen covered a lot of this, and so I'll just sort of reinforce the issues which are related to grant expenses rather than just the grant provider side. So grant expenses is the term used to describe expenditure on grants, donations and similar transfers. The term grant expenses, just to be clear, it's not the expense that a provider would incur, for example, grant-funded salary costs. A grant expense is where a recipient provides funding in cash terms, transfer resources or a service or a good or other asset without directly, and this is the important point, receiving resources in return. So this means that it differs from procurement. Next slide, please. And this is the same slide that Karen went through this morning. Grant expenses can be categorized, as we've talked about, in enforceable grant arrangements or other funding arrangements. Next slide, please, Sam. To focus on a little more from the provider perspective of the OFA, an OFA may arise without any obligation for the grant provider to transfer resources. Where this is the case, resources are recognised when they are transferred and they are recognised at the carrying amount of the resources transferred. Next slide, please. So a probably important development from a grant provider's side is the OFAs with constraints. So where there may be constraints on an OFA, and such constraints would be about the overall purpose, perhaps, or about a region where resources are applied, or a time period in which the resources should be expended. So there's no present obligation in these arrangements because there's not normally and doesn't not normally affect the recognition of grant expense. So the expenses are recognised when they've met the terms of the agreement. At future date, the grant recipient might breach the constraints, which is an important part of it, in the arrangements and have a present obligation to make good the failure. And so if there is a present obligation on behalf of the grant recipient, then that may mean that there is a grant, there's an asset from the grant provider, and that might be a financial asset if there is for example, cash refund due to the grant provider. Next slide, please. So with the EGAs, there is a need to recognise or identify when you're doing it, and Karen talked about this earlier, each grant fulfilment right, and they will correspond to each enforceable grant obligation for the provider. So this would the EGAs may need to be aggregated because they may be interrelated, interdependent. Gosh, I can't say that word. Activities supported by grants, and where this is the case, the grant provider can't aggregate those until it meets the definition of a distinct fulfilment right, grant fulfilment right. And that point, the grant providing MPO will need to determine a standalone selling price, a standalone amount for the grant fulfilment price, and for each distinct right. So it's necessary to wait until one or both parties have fulfilled their obligations before expenses are recognised. And a grant expense is recognised by the grant providing MPO when the grant fulfilment right is met. This occurs because the grant recipient has transferred satisfied the EGO. The grant expense is measured at the standalone selling point. Sorry. Sam, could you move on, please? I won't spend too long on enforceable grant arrangements variable consideration, but variable considerations might occur when an EGA may not know at the beginning of arrangement just how much it will need to recognise. This might be because there are incentives or there are penalties, or that there's a contingent event that is not yet taken place. So you don't know how much needs to be recognised. And a variable consideration may need to be recognised as provision and measured as such, and the provision in parts of the INPAG arrangements. Next slide, please. An important point, and one of the reasons that sits behind this, the stipulations here, is that an EGA might be payable over more than one financial year. So EGAs may be payable over the period of more than one financial year, but where a grant providing MPO has present obligation to transfer resources because the grant recipient has met its EGOs, it recognises a liability and an expense. This will be for the total amount of the resources to be transferred to the recipient, and it must be recognised even if the payment hasn't been made. So it's even if it's in a future reporting period. When the grant MPO does not have a present obligation to transfer resources in future years, because the grant recipient has not met its obligations, the grant providing MPO will not recognise a liability and an expense. But where the grant providing MPO has discretion in future years because of the terms of the EGA, it should not recognise a liability because the grant providing MPO does not have a present obligation to transfer those resources.
Yeah, I think we're going to need to move on. So
yep. So the accounting for EGAs in terms of capital grants is the same as any other grant, and the important point is that resources should be recognised when there is an obligation. I'll move on very quickly to the next one. And this is an important point as well in terms of rights and obligations and standalone selling amounts, is the amount of information that has to be thought about in terms of practical considerations, and monitoring arrangements will be important. Next slide. In terms of principal and agent, this isn't any different from normal accounting arrangements, but MPOs have control of resources and therefore they are principal, and they are agents when they do not have control of resources and therefore do not recognise expense. Next slide. There are some disclosures about the purpose of the EGA, the existence of the potential consequences of variable consideration, which I've talked about, significant payment terms, and the nature of the resources transferred. Next slide, please. An important point with grant expenses is the provision of sensitive information. It might be about the safety or well-being, staff and volunteers, the safety and well-being of grant recipients, or it might be about prejudicing the ability to deliver the mission or purpose. But it cannot be used to avoid disclosures. Sorry, that was a very rush through the last couple of slides.
Super, thank you, Sarah. Well done. So again, we're going to break out rooms again. Again, there's 3 questions. So if room 1 could start with question 1, etc. And when you feel that you've given that some due consideration, you can move on. What we'll do is I'll post these questions into the breakout rooms. In fact, let me try and post them now. Oopsie. Let me stop sharing and then I can actually select it. Sorry. Give me. All right, this is just post this into the chat now. That's it in Spanish. And then, oh, I seem to have closed the file. Oh. Computers, who needs them? Horrible things. Bear with me, sorry. And here are the questions in English. There we are. Right. So if you can maybe copy paste those questions, then so you can paste them into your Zoom room chat and discuss away. So it's 4 minutes past for me now. I think we can have 15 minutes in those rooms, Brian, and we'll see you back here shortly. Thank you, everybody. Super. Welcome back. Room 3, I think that is. You're always the first to return. Is everybody back now? Wonderful. I love it when you come back and you're all smiling. It just lets me know that you're enjoying those conversations and the chance to debate and discuss, which is exactly what we wanted. And I think that's much better in the breakouts than in this big meeting. So I'm glad you're having that chance. So Brian, if you'd help me launch the second poll. And again, we'll have some sort of quiet time while you can complete the poll and hopefully share some of those key points that are coming from the group discussion and from yourself in the chat. That would be super. Thank you.
It is just the question number 1 is changed, but the other is the same.
I was looking at one and seeing that was different, but I think you're right. It's on question 1 here. Something's gone wrong, and the final questions are a repeat.
I've put question 2 in the chat. If you want to respond to question 2 in the chat, feel free to do. I'm sorry, this is I've made an error somewhere. And then there's this is a 3-question poll, so there's question 3 as well.
And can you put them up in Spanish as well, Sam?
They are in Spanish as well. So it's got English, then Spanish, then French, but the answers are only in English. On the poll, you can still complete it, but we'll ignore the answers to questions 2 and 3 because they're the same as before. So question 1 was about agreeing the full amount of the grant expense if the grant provider has no realistic means to avoid it, even if it's for multi-year. So 41% yes, 36% yes, but, and 9% no. So that's very interesting. I'll stop sharing that because the other questions are not what they were supposed to be. But thank you for those of you that have responded in the chat. I'm seeing a really good mixture of comments and some really good ideas why your yes buts or your no's are there, which is also really helpful. I'm being asked for the link for the poll. The poll was just in Zoom, but we will actually be sending out a survey on the 1st of March, which will be in 3 languages. So if that's something that would be helpful for you, for that. I think in the last 3 minutes, let me move to closing. Even as you keep typing your comments there, you're very, very welcome to do that. Doesn't look good. I get recording again. Don't worry, it's one slide. Basically, it doesn't really matter. I'll share the slide next with you. Technology is not my friend today. So really basically to say thank you so much. I know this has been a difficult experience with all the chat and the breakout rooms and everything, but I'm really, really grateful for your time. Our biggest hope is that this will have given you some ideas and some discussion points and some ideas bounced off each other so that you can submit a substantive response using the template on the website. It's on, I will type the website. I'm sure you all know, all of you know the website by now. You probably know it better than I do. And they have your say page, which has the template where you can share your detailed responses and really feel like you have a voice. And we will definitely consider those points. We will also be issuing a Survey Monkey survey, which won't have as much space to say as many different detailed things, but might also be useful for you depending on the level of time and the depth of response that you want to be able to submit. Thank you so much to my colleagues in SIPFA for all the hard work presenting. Thank you to each of you. Thank you, Brian, for all the breakouts and for every single one of you for coming. We will be sharing the recording and the chat, but we will anonymize it so that, or possibly summarize it so that people can see, and there's accountability, but obviously respecting your privacy in that respect. So thank you very, very much for 90 precious minutes of your time. Have a wonderful day. We might see some of you in a couple of hours for session 2. Thank you very, very much. Bye-bye.